Thank you, Ms. Houcher, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for testifying today. I want to just say how frustrated I am that this hearing is even necessary. I would be naive to not to recognize, though, anti-Semitism on our university campuses, including my home state. As you may know, this fall, 2 members of the Indiana University student government published a resignation letter due to the blatant anti-Semitism of the student body president. According to their firsthand testimony, this student body president was intentionally neglecting the experience of Jewish students on campus by not only refusing to meet or work with Jewish students, but by actively ignoring the voices of those who tried to bring attention to their issues and the concerns for the well-being of their Jewish students. It's especially appalling when we recognize that 10% of Indiana University's student body is Jewish. Campus life in the United States has become a daily trial of intimidation and insult for our Jewish students, a hostile environment that began with statements from pro-Palestinian student organizations justifying terrorism has now rapidly spiraled into death threats and physical attacks, leaving Jewish students alarmed and vulnerable. At least 124 anti-Semitic incidents have been reported on campuses since October 7th, and that's likely a severe undercount. The response to this has been empty rhetoric. Words have been weak, action has been slow. No action has resulted in Jewish students feeling safe or welcome. This example is why I'm an original co-sponsor of a congressional resolution condemning the support of Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist organizations at our institutions of higher education. We will not tolerate the creation of a hostile environment for our Jewish students, faculty, and staff on college campuses. If you won't do it, then we will take action ourselves. Madam Chair, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the gentlewoman from New York.
Dr. Kornbluth, yes. At MIT, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate MIT's code of conduct or rules regarding bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
If targeted at individuals, not making public statements.
Yes or no? Calling for the genocide of Jews does not constitute bullying and harassment?
I have not heard calling for the genocide for Jews on our campus.
But you've heard chants for intifada.
I've heard chants, which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context, when calling for the elimination of the Jewish people.
So those would not be according to the MIT's code of conduct or rules?
That would be investigated as harassment if pervasive and severe.
Ms. McGill, at Penn, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
If the speech turns into conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
I am asking specifically calling for the genocide of Jews. Does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context. That is not bullying or harassment. This is the easiest question to answer yes, Ms. McGill. So is your testimony that you will not answer yes?
If it if the
yes
speech
or
becomes
no?
if the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
Conduct meaning committing the act of genocide? The speech is not harassment? This is unacceptable, Ms. McGill. I'm going to give you one more opportunity for the world to see your answer. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's code of conduct when it comes to bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be harassment.
The answer is yes. And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
What's the context?
Targeted as an individual, targeted at an individual.
It's targeted at Jewish students, Jewish individuals. Do you understand your testimony is dehumanizing them? Do you understand that dehumanization is part of anti-Semitism? I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct, that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Freedom of speech protects not just popular speech. I've heard many of you refer to that. Can you comment on what speech is protected and what speech is not protected? Dr. Gay.
Speech is protected, and that protection extends even to speech we find objectionable and offensive and even outrageous. It's when speech crosses into conduct that violates our very clear policies around bullying, harassment, intimidation, that it becomes actionable.
Now, when it's targeted and creates imminent threats of violence, that can actually be criminal.
Yes.
But the Title VI standard isn't that, it doesn't require all of that. You can just have you can have much less of a standard to create a violation of Title VI. When do you know, what is the Title VI standard for when speech violates Title VI and creates a hostile environment?
I cannot recite that from memory.
Does anybody know from the kinds of things that would constitute a Title VI violation?
Yeah, hostile environment that prevents the students from attaining their educational acquisition.
Students have a right to feel safe on campus. Would the standard of a hostile environment apply to all students or just Jewish students?
All students.
Dr. McGill, a lot has been said about some of the speakers that have been invited. Who invites the speakers?
Congressman, it varies. It might be a student organization, it might be a faculty member, it might be a staff member. It might be my office.
Well, does your office always control who the speakers, what speakers are invited?
No, there's no pre-approval process for the speakers who are invited. It's quite decentralized.
And if some group, student group invited somebody that the university found offensive, what happens?
Well, we don't prevent a speaker from coming to campus, following the guidance of the United States Constitution based on the views that we think they're going to express. We sometimes condemn those views if they're deeply inconsistent with our values, but we don't censor or prevent speakers from coming based on the views, even if they're offensive.
And Dr. Gay, you said several students are subject to disciplinary actions. Typically, how long does that disciplinary action take to be completed?
So the process, we try to move with all deliberate speed, but it varies depending on the complexity of the incident. It could be a matter of days or weeks, or it could be a bit longer than that. And the range of consequences vary, but up to and including expulsion from Harvard.
Several comments have been made that the campuses are full of anti-Semitism, and that's the only problem on campus. Again, the university president's comment on that.
It is not the only problem on campus. It's particularly acute at this moment. And as I've mentioned before, students have offered searing testimony about what they've been experiencing. But it's not just anti-Semitism, it's also Islamophobia and frankly just hostility to individuals who are visibly Muslim. or Arab or Palestinian. And then we also have other student communities that feel marginalized, not just in this moment, but have been struggling to feel a sense of belonging at Harvard for some years, including students of color.
Ms. McGill?
I would describe very much the same experience at the University of Pennsylvania, as Dr. Gay described.
Dr.
Yes.
Hornbloth?
Racism, Islamophobia, anti-LGBTQ sentiment. One thing, if I might add, about free speech on campus with these issues is that the best way to fight negative speech is more speech. To have speakers and individuals who fight anti-Semitism and can speak to our students on campus.
Thank you. You back. Thank you, Dr. Fox. I want to thank our witnesses for participating in today's hearing. Protecting students from discrimination and harassment is central to fostering a safe and welcoming campuses. Regrettably, following the October 7th attacks, college campuses have experienced a disturbing rise in incidents of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It's great to have the opportunity to hear directly from campus leaders on what they are doing to be more proactive and prevent incidences of violence and harassment on campus. And I applaud President Biden's leadership and the administration for actively helping institutions protect students as part of the White House's national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. Under the President's direction, the Department of Education has provided additional guidance to colleges and universities on how to uphold their obligation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and better address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of discrimination on campus. They've already opened about 15 Title VI investigations into recent incidences on campus since October 7th. And finally, as members of Congress, we also have the responsibility to condemn discrimination as we see it, and we should fully fund the Office of Civil Rights so that they will have the resources to investigate these cases. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ranking Member. Post-secondary education has never been held in such low esteem in our country as it is today. Indeed, I do not refer to colleges and universities any longer as higher education because it's my opinion that higher order skills are not being taught and learned. And I think today's hearing indicates that. I think Mr. Williams was on to something in his line of questioning about why are we here at this stage when you all talk about education being the answer to the problems. Now I want to remind everyone why we're here. I started the hearing by recognizing the students we have in the audience today. You're the ones bearing the brunt of the hate that is festering on our campuses. You're the reason we're calling attention to these issues and will continue holding college leaders accountable for failing to protect you. You're heroes, and I thank you for your courage. One of the students here today is Talia Khan. She's an undergraduate alumna of MIT and currently a graduate student there. And she wrote a letter to the committee. I request unanimous consent to submit her full letter for the record without objection. I encourage all the members to read it. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read the whole thing, but I want to give you a sample. Quote, I'm a Jewish student, the daughter of a Jewish mother and an Afghan Muslim father. I'd like to bring to your attention my perspective as a Jewish student currently immersed in an extremely toxic atmosphere at MIT, unquote. She goes on to describe a litany of violence, harassment, and bullying against Jewish students on MIT's campus and inaction by the MIT administration. She then concludes with a plea for help from the MIT administration. Quote, unfortunately, I have been put in charge of working to keep MIT students feeling safe. I have been put in charge of advocating for hundreds of frightened students, afraid of retribution. I want to stop being told about the most recent anti-Semitic incident and feeling like I have to push and push to report it, even though nothing ever gets done. This should not be my job. Sally Kornbluth, please let me be a student again. It is your job to keep Jewish students safe, not mine, unquote. Talia, thank you for sharing your ordeal with this committee. Talia happens to be a student at MIT. Unfortunately, her story isn't unique to that campus. Horrific acts of hate, violence, and intimidation are happening at the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and institutions all over the country. And institutional leaders are failing to meet the movement with courage, clarity, or decisive action. I also ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a Wall Street Journal op-ed from this past Sunday by Lance Morrow. The op-ed is called, quote, "The New Anti-Semitism is the Oldest Kind," end quote, without objection. This op-ed is clear-eyed about the threat we face. Talking about the anti-Semitism of the post-war era, Morrow said, quote, "America's anti-Semites in those days were more fools than monsters," unquote. Then he says, quote, "The anti-Semitism that is poured forth onto the country's streets and campuses in the autumn of 2023 is a different thing. A reversion to a politics of aggressive, unapologetic hate. Of course, the new Jew haters, especially young people on campuses, think of themselves as perfectly virtuous. What is 1,000 times worse, they think of their Jew hatred as righteous. It's morally fashionable among them," unquote. And this brings me back to the beginning. Presidents Gay, McGill, and Kornbluth, you have real and important practical challenges. These are real students sitting here, and they need to be protected. But you also have a moral challenge. It is fashionable among too many members of your campus communities to hate Jews. It is ideological acceptable. As you do the practical work of protecting your campus, you must also do the rhetorical work of changing hearts and minds. That's your job as a campus president. That means being willing to risk your job to speak truth clearly, consistently, and unapologetically, even when the Jew haters turn their hate to you. We'll now be watching, and I genuinely hope, for the sake of our nation, you will rise to meet the challenge. Without objection, there being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.